On the morning of the 20th of October, 1966, in the mining village of Aberfan in South Wales, a 10-year-old girl named Eryl Mai Jones told her mother about a dream she had just woken from. "I dreamed I went to school and there was no school there. Something black had come down all over it." Her mother, probably thinking this was ordinary childhood anxiety, gave her breakfast and sent her to school. The next morning, Eryl Mai went to school again. Shortly after classes began, a massive coal slurry tip on the mountain above the village collapsed. A black wall of waste slid down the slope and buried the Pancras Junior School under thousands of tons of sludge. 144 people died, including 116 children. Eryl Mai was among them. Her mother reported the dream to investigators after the disaster. Other family members corroborated that the child had described it the previous morning, before any of it had happened. Eryl Mai was not the only one. In the weeks before the disaster, dozens of people across the United Kingdom reported dreams, hunches, and waking impressions that anticipated features of the coming catastrophe. John Barker, a British psychiatrist at Shelton Hospital in Shropshire, placed a request in the national press for anyone who had experienced anticipatory awareness of the disaster to contact him. 76 people responded. 35 of them had told other people about their experience before the disaster occurred, providing the kind of witness corroboration that transforms individual reports into evidence. The accounts included specific details: the location, the timing, the black material, the children. The accuracy across independent reports was substantial enough that Barker concluded something real was happening, that the conventional framework of causation could not accommodate. The literature of anticipatory dreams extends back as far as written records go. In the Senate House of Ancient Rome, on March 15 of the year 44 BCE, Calpurnia, the wife of Julius Caesar, begged her husband not to attend the Senate that day. She had dreamed the previous night of Caesar's assassination, seeing his body in her arms, seeing herself weeping. The dream was vivid and left her convinced of specific danger. Caesar dismissed the warning at first, but reconsidered when he awoke and felt unwell. He decided to stay home. His friend Decimus Brutus came to the house and persuaded him to attend the Senate anyway, arguing that staying away would appear weak. Caesar went. He was assassinated on the Senate floor, stabbed 23 times by members of the conspiracy. Calpurnia's dream, recorded by multiple classical historians, including Plutarch, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, has become one of the most famous premonitions in historical literature. Shakespeare dramatized the scene in Julius Caesar. The dream itself, whatever one concludes about its source, is documented across independent ancient sources that were in a position to know. On the 15th of April, 1912, an ocean liner struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank with a loss of over 1,500 lives. In the weeks before the Titanic's maiden voyage, dozens of people had refused to sail, cancelled their bookings, or reported dreams and hunches that warned them away. The journalist William Stead, who died in the sinking, had received multiple warnings from psychically sensitive acquaintances, one of whom specifically described a shipwreck. Stead had himself written 2 short fiction pieces decades earlier that anticipated his own eventual death. One, published in 1886, described a steamship that sank in the North Atlantic after striking another ship with inadequate lifeboats, resulting in extensive loss of life. The other, published in 1892, described a shipwreck that killed a man named Stead. The author of both was the man who would die exactly as his fiction had described, on a ship that sank in the North Atlantic with inadequate lifeboats. Stead boarded anyway, reportedly because he believed his own death was fated regardless of what he did. 14 years before the disaster, in 1898, the American novelist Morgan Robertson had published a short novel called Futility, describing the sinking of a fictional ocean liner called the Titan, struck by an iceberg on her maiden voyage in the North Atlantic, with insufficient lifeboats to save her passengers. When the actual Titanic sank, the parallels were specific enough that Robertson reissued his novel and claimed he had seen the events in his imagination before writing them. Jack Marshall, a Titanic passenger's relative in Hertfordshire, reportedly ran from his house the night of the 14th of April, 1912, shouting that the Titanic was sinking. He described seeing the ship going down, with passengers clinging to it. News of the actual sinking did not reach the United Kingdom until hours later. Mrs. J. E. Hippack of Chicago had a vision of the Titanic in distress on the evening of the sinking and told her family, who documented the account before verification of the disaster arrived. These cases, along with dozens of others, were collected by researchers in the months after the disaster and published in journals of psychical research. The accumulated evidence around the Titanic sinking, the refused bookings, the documented warnings, the Robertson novel, the dream reports collected afterward suggests that something about the coming catastrophe was reaching human awareness before it occurred. On the night of the 14th of April, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, described a dream to his wife Mary and a small group of confidants at the White House. In the dream, Lincoln walked through the halls of the White House and heard sobbing. Following the sound, he came to the East Room, where he found a coffin guarded by soldiers. A mourner was weeping beside it. Lincoln asked one of the soldiers who had died. "The President," the soldier answered. "He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln told his wife and friends the dream had unsettled him. 3 days later, on the 14th of April, 1865, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theatre by John Wilkes Booth and died the following morning. His body was placed in a coffin and laid in state in the East Room of the White House, guarded by soldiers, mourners weeping beside it. The dream was documented in the memoir of Ward Hill Lamon, Lincoln's friend and former law partner, who recorded the specific conversation in which Lincoln had described the dream days before his death. On the 22nd of June, 1858, the American writer, the most famous American writer of the 19th century, Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, was staying in St. Louis while working on a Mississippi riverboat. His younger brother Henry was working on another steamboat, the Pennsylvania, which Twain had helped him secure. That night, Twain dreamed that Henry lay in a metal coffin in his sister's sitting room, with a bouquet of white flowers on his chest and a single red rose in the center. The dream was so vivid that Twain woke convinced Henry had died. He went downstairs distressed, only to be reassured by his sister that it had been only a dream. A few weeks later, the Pennsylvania's boilers exploded on the Mississippi River. Henry suffered severe burns and died days later from his injuries. When Twain arrived at the scene, he found that local women had taken up a collection to buy his brother a special coffin, a metal one, rather than the pine box most victims received. As Twain stood beside the coffin, which had been placed in his sister's sitting room, a woman approached and laid a bouquet of white flowers on Henry's chest. In the center of the bouquet was a single red rose. Twain recorded the dream and its fulfillment in his autobiography. He wrote about it as one of the defining experiences of his life, an encounter with something that convinced him that the rational framework of his time did not fully describe reality. In 1428, a 17-year-old French peasant named Joan of Arc began reporting visions and voices that she said came from specific saints. The voices told her that she would lead French armies to victory against the English occupation and see the Dauphin crowned King of France at Reims. At the time of her claims, France had been losing the 100 Years' War for nearly a century. The Dauphin had not been crowned. The English occupied most of northern France, including Reims, the traditional coronation site. Joan's predictions about her own future role and the specific outcomes she would achieve were documented in advance by witnesses who heard her describe them, then watched her fulfill them. Within 2 years, Joan had led French armies to decisive victories, broken the siege of Orleans, and stood beside the Dauphin as he was crowned Charles VII at Reims Cathedral. The predictions she had made at 17 had come true in detail. Her trial records, preserved in full, document both her original claims and their fulfillment. The documentation has been studied by historians for 6 centuries, and no adequate conventional explanation has emerged for how an illiterate peasant produced accurate predictions about events that no reasonable person at the time would have expected to occur. These are not isolated cases. The documented examples I have just described are selected from thousands in the historical record. They are the well-known cases, the ones that can be verified through independent sources and that have been studied by historians and investigators. These are not isolated cases. The historical record contains tens of thousands of documented anticipatory experiences of this kind, spanning every era and every culture in which human beings have kept records. They are not evenly distributed across types of events. They cluster around moments of significant death, catastrophe, and transition the events that most deeply matter to the people who experience the anticipation. They cluster around relationships of specific emotional connection, with mothers anticipating their children's fates, partners anticipating each other's crises, close friends anticipating each other's turning points. They cluster in certain states of consciousness more than others, appearing more readily in dreams and in moments of quiet attention than in ordinary waking distraction. And they carry, in many cases, the distinctive felt quality that experiencers describe as a knowing that arrives rather than being constructed information that enters awareness, with a particular tone of certainty, different from the tone of anxious speculation or hopeful wishing. The distribution is not random. Researchers have noted that anticipatory experiences correlate with specific features of the anticipated events. Emotional intensity matters. The events that most commonly appear in premonitions involve death, disaster, and significant transitions in people's lives. Relational proximity matters. Premonitions about loved ones occur at far higher rates than premonitions about strangers. State of consciousness matters. The dream state and other relaxed states appear more conducive to reception than ordinary waking distraction. Individual sensitivity varies. Some people appear to have substantially greater receptivity than others, with the capacity running in particular families in some cases. These patterns, replicated across populations and decades, suggest that the phenomenon has specific structural features that consistent investigation can document. The conventional framework of how human beings acquire knowledge has no adequate explanation for these phenomena. Information is supposed to reach your brain through your senses, which register events happening in the present moment. Your brain processes these signals, integrates them with memory of past events, and produces your conscious awareness of the world around you. The processing operates on events that have already occurred. Future events have not occurred. They cannot send signals through any known channel. They cannot stimulate your senses. They cannot be integrated with memories of things that have not yet happened. Within the conventional framework, anticipation of specific future events should not be possible. The cases in the historical record suggest it happens anyway, which means that the framework, despite its power to explain ordinary perception and cognition, is incomplete. Laboratory-based investigation began once the field had accumulated enough case material to motivate systematic study. The systematic collection of these experiences began in the 19th century, when the Society for Psychical Research was founded in London in 1882. Its early members included the philosopher Henry Sidgwick, the physicist William Barrett, and the classicist Frederick Myers, serious scholars who approached the phenomena with the scientific standards of their era. They documented thousands of cases, investigated them for alternative explanations, and published their findings in the Proceedings of the Society. Their work established that the phenomenon was real as a category of human experience, even if they could not fully explain its mechanism. The investigation continued at Duke University in the 1930s under Joseph Banks Rhine and his wife Louisa Rhine. While Joseph focused on controlled experimental protocols, Louisa took a different approach. She collected spontaneous case reports from ordinary people across the United States, letters describing dreams, impressions, and experiences that seemed to anticipate specific future events. Her collection grew to include over 10,000 cases, carefully categorized and analyzed. The patterns she documented have been confirmed by subsequent research across multiple decades. Premonition experiences cluster into identifiable categories with consistent structural features, regardless of the cultural backgrounds of the experiencers or the specific events anticipated. The Rhine's categorization identified 4 primary types, with specific percentages reflecting the distribution across their collection. Approximately 60% of documented cases involve dreams. The dreaming state appears to provide particular conditions under which anticipatory information becomes accessible, conditions that the waking mind, with its stronger filtering, does not typically provide. Another substantial category involves sudden waking impressions, flashes of knowing that arrive without apparent cause in the middle of ordinary activity. A driver suddenly decides to take a different route home. A parent feels an urgent need to check on a child who appeared to be fine. A traveler cancels a flight for no reason they can articulate. Sometimes these impressions turn out to be meaningless. Sometimes they turn out to have saved the experiencer from catastrophe that the experiencer could not have known about through ordinary channels. Dream premonitions themselves take several forms that merit note. Some involve symbolic dream content whose connection to subsequent events requires interpretation. The dreamer sees images that, in retrospect, correspond to the specific coming event through metaphor rather than literal representation. Others involve literal dream content. The dreamer sees the event itself, playing out in the dream exactly as it will subsequently occur in waking life. Eryl Mai Jones's dream of the school being covered by something black was partially literal, partially symbolic. Lincoln's dream of his own coffin in the East Room was almost entirely literal. Mark Twain's dream of his brother's funeral arrangement was entirely literal in its details. The range of dream modalities appears to reflect differences in the consciousness states during which the dreams occur, and perhaps the nature of the channel through which the anticipatory content reached the dreaming mind. A third category involves somatic premonition, physical sensations that precede rather than follow the events they relate to. A sudden chill without apparent cause, a feeling of dread that settles into the body before any threatening event has occurred. A physical reaction that arrives hours before the situation that would normally have produced it. The person experiences the response before the stimulus. Something has already happened in the body that the conscious mind cannot account for. The research on these somatic phenomena has been substantial, and we will examine it more carefully in a later part of this investigation. A fourth category involves empathic premonition, knowledge that a specifically connected person is in crisis at the moment. The crisis is occurring at a distance. The research on long-distance awareness of significant events in loved ones' lives has accumulated substantial case evidence. Parents waking at the moment their adult children had accidents. Spouses knowing of their partner's deaths under circumstances they could not have learned about through ordinary means. Close friends becoming aware of each other's crises in real time across substantial geographical distances. The time-stamped cases, when witnesses can corroborate the timing, provide some of the most compelling individual evidence for something occurring that the conventional framework cannot explain. The Scottish chemist David Booth had a recurring dream in May 1979 of a commercial aircraft crashing, showing specific details: the red, white, and blue tail markings of American Airlines, the view from a particular angle, the exact manner of the crash. The dream recurred multiple times over 10 nights. Booth contacted the Federal Aviation Administration and American Airlines to warn them. His reports were documented in writing before any event occurred. On the 25th of May, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 crashed on takeoff from Chicago O'Hare International Airport, killing all 271 people aboard and 2 on the ground. The details Booth had described the airline, the coloring, the manner of the crash matched the actual event. His FAA reports, filed days before the crash, remain on record. The documented cases across these categories span history. Joseph's dream interpretations in Egypt, warning of 7 years of famine after 7 years of plenty. Daniel's visions of empires rising and falling centuries before the events occurred. The Greek oracle at Delphi, where the Pythia delivered pronouncements while in altered states induced by gases rising from the fault lines beneath the temple, was consulted by kings and generals for over 1,000 years. Herodotus recorded dozens of cases in which Delphic predictions proved accurate, including Croesus of Lydia being told that if he attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire, which turned out to be his own. The pattern of the predictions was often riddling, requiring interpretation, but the interpretive difficulty did not prevent the phenomenon from being taken seriously as providing genuine anticipatory information. The Sibylline prophecies that shaped Roman political decisions, the medieval mystics and saints whose anticipatory pronouncements were documented by their contemporaries, the indigenous visionaries whose warnings of coming European contact were preserved in the oral traditions of the peoples who received them. The Scottish Highland seers whose specific premonitions of specific deaths were documented by 17th century investigators. The same phenomenon, appearing across geographies and centuries and cultural frameworks that had no contact with each other. During World War II, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was repeatedly reported to have experienced premonitions that saved his life. On one occasion, preparing to enter his car after a dinner engagement during the Blitz, Churchill opened the door to the passenger side where he normally sat, then paused and walked around to the far side, getting in on the driver's side instead. Minutes later, a bomb exploded near the car. The explosion blast lifted the vehicle and nearly tipped it over, but the force was concentrated on the passenger side. Churchill's bodyguards asked what had made him change his seat. He said only that something had told him to go around. On another occasion, during an air raid, Churchill refused to enter a particular bomb shelter and directed his staff to a different one. The first shelter received a direct hit that night. These incidents, documented by witnesses including his secretary and his bodyguards, were reported across multiple biographies of Churchill without adequate conventional explanation. The consistency is striking. Traditions that developed independently produced similar categorizations of the phenomenon, similar accounts of the conditions under which it becomes accessible, similar methodologies for distinguishing reliable, anticipatory content from unreliable content. The Islamic tradition's framework of true dreams versus false dreams parallels the Christian distinction between genuine prophecy and psychological projection. The Hindu tradition's categorization of siddhis parallels the Buddhist tradition's cataloguing of abhijnas, with both including the capacity for knowledge of future events among the fruits of advanced contemplative practice. The indigenous traditions across continents developed specific practices for accessing anticipatory information through dreams, vision quests, and altered states. The Norse Velur priestesses, who practiced a form of prophecy called seidr, produced predictive pronouncements for Viking communities that were taken seriously enough to shape military and political decisions. The Celtic Druids maintained similar practices in pre-Christian Britain and Gaul. The Greek oracle at Dodona, operating from the Bronze Age until late antiquity, provided predictions through the interpretation of the rustling oak leaves at the sanctuary site. These convergent developments across isolated traditions suggest that the phenomenon they were engaging is real rather than constructed. The pattern persists into the modern era, with disasters that have been extensively documented. before the 11th of September 2001 attacks, multiple people reported dreams and impressions anticipating the events. A woman in Connecticut wrote in her journal on September 10 that she had dreamed of airplanes crashing into tall buildings and people falling from high windows. She showed the journal entry to her husband that morning, hours before the attacks began. Several people cancelled flights on the days leading up to September 11, based on vague uneasiness they could not articulate. The analysis of options market activity in the week before the attacks documented specific trading patterns that appeared to anticipate the financial consequences of the attacks on airline and insurance stocks. Whether these patterns reflected insider information from people who knew of the coming attacks or some more diffuse anticipatory response remains disputed. But the patterns were real, documented by financial analysts at the time, and they point at something that routine explanations struggle to fully cover. The modern research has continued to document instances that the conventional framework cannot accommodate. The British Premonitions Bureau, founded by John Barker in 1967 after his Aberfan investigation, collected several hundred predictions during its years of operation. Some of them proved to correspond to subsequent events with detail that coincidence could not easily explain. The Bureau's methodology was imperfect, and many of the predictions it received did not come true. But the documented hits remain as evidence of a capacity that the dismissive framework cannot easily incorporate. The sequel to Barker's Aberfan investigation was itself remarkable. The case of Alan Hencher, one of the British Premonitions Bureau's most accurate contributors, deserves specific attention. Hencher had contacted Barker in 1967 with a series of predictions, including one warning that Barker himself would die within the next 12 months. Barker received the prediction, noted it, and continued his work. In August 1968, at age 44, Barker died unexpectedly of natural causes. The premonition, filed months before and preserved in the Bureau's files, turned out to have been accurate. Hencher had no formal training in prediction, no religious claim to special gifts, no apparent reason to be better than anyone else at this kind of anticipatory perception. He was an ordinary postal worker who reported dreams that frequently corresponded to subsequent news events. The Bureau's staff tracked his predictions systematically, including those that did not come true, and found that his hit rate substantially exceeded what chance would have produced. He continued to contribute predictions for years afterward, with a hit rate that the Bureau's staff found remarkable enough to document in detail. The accumulated weight of evidence is substantial. Individual cases can always be challenged. Selection bias, memory reconstruction, coincidence, fraud. Any single case can be explained away. But the aggregation, across thousands of cases, across centuries of documentation, across cultures that had no contact with each other, produces a pattern that the dismissive explanations cannot account for coherently. The phenomenon is real. The mechanism is what requires explanation. We will engage those questions in the parts that follow. The second part of this investigation will examine the physics that makes such a mechanism possible. Einstein's theory of relativity, which established that time does not flow the way ordinary experience suggests, provides the foundation. The quantum mechanical experiments on retrocausality, which have demonstrated that later events can influence earlier ones under specific experimental conditions, provide specific mechanisms. The theoretical frameworks of John Cramer and Yakir Aharonov, which treat quantum events as transactions between past and future rather than purely sequential processes, provide conceptual tools for understanding how information from the future could reach the present. What emerges from the physics is not magic. It is a picture of reality substantially stranger than common sense suggests, but entirely consistent with the best confirmed science we possess, and entirely able to accommodate the phenomenon that the historical record documents. The third part will engage the traditions that have been investigating this phenomenon for thousands of years: the Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, and indigenous frameworks that developed sophisticated methodologies for cultivating and evaluating anticipatory capacity. Nostradamus, whose 16th century quatrains have been interpreted across 5 centuries as containing anticipatory content about subsequent events, represents a specific kind of documented prediction literature whose evaluation remains contested. The quatrains are ambiguous enough that interpretations vary widely, and the post hoc matching of specific events to specific quatrains is susceptible to confirmation bias. But the phenomenon of Nostradamus, and of similar predictive literatures across cultures, indicates the depth of the human preoccupation with anticipatory knowledge. People have been trying to access the future, and finding that some access appears to be genuinely possible for as long as records exist. The fourth part will bring everything together, examining what the integrated picture means for how you relate to your own anticipatory experiences, how you distinguish genuine signals from ordinary projection, and what it implies about your place in a reality whose structure extends across time in ways that modern culture has largely forgotten. The fourth part will bring everything together. But before we turn to physics and traditions, let us sit for a moment with the weight of the case material. The cases that have been documented are not fringe claims by credulous enthusiasts. Many of them come from the people we most trust to have been careful about what they reported: presidents, major writers, scientists, serious historians, journalists who staked their reputations on factual accuracy. The cases were documented, in many instances, before the anticipated events occurred, in writing that can still be examined. The witnesses corroborated the timing. The specific details matched. Something was happening that the conventional framework does not handle gracefully. For now, hold the cases in mind. A child who saw her school buried before it happened. A Roman statesman who was warned in a dream by his wife about the Ides of March. A president who saw himself in a coffin days before his assassination. A French peasant who described her military victories before any had occurred. A writer whose brother's specific funeral arrangements appeared in a dream weeks before the accident that killed him. Dozens of people who refused to board a doomed ship because something had warned them. Tens of thousands of documented instances across cultures and centuries pointing toward the same conclusion. The case material points toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Something in human beings sometimes knows what is coming. The knowing is partial, unreliable, difficult to control, but something in the phenomenon is real, and a complete picture of what human consciousness is must account for it. The contemplative traditions of the world have been engaging the phenomenon of anticipatory knowledge for thousands of years. Their engagement was not casual. It was not the superstitious dabbling that modern dismissive accounts have often suggested. The Greek oracle at Delphi operated for over 1,000 years, consulted by kings and generals whose political decisions rested on its pronouncements. The Chinese I Ching has been used for anticipatory consultation for at least 3,000 years. The Tibetan state oracle has been consulted by the Dalai Lamas for over 6 centuries. These are not the institutions of primitive peoples failing to understand probability. They are the institutions of sophisticated civilizations that found anticipatory consultation reliable enough to build lasting practice around it. The engagement was systematic, sustained, methodologically sophisticated, and grounded in extensive phenomenological documentation that distinguishes reliable forms of anticipatory knowledge from unreliable forms with discriminations that contemporary research is only beginning to recover. The Christian tradition has developed what may be the most extensive framework for understanding and engaging anticipatory knowledge in any tradition. The development is rooted in the foundational texts of Christianity itself. The Hebrew Bible, which Christianity inherited, contains extensive premonitory material. Joseph's dreams, as a young man, anticipated his rise to power in Egypt. Pharaoh's dreams of the fat and lean cattle anticipated the famine that would strike 7 years later. Daniel's visions described empires that would rise and fall across centuries. The prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible is largely anticipatory in character. The prophets spoke not merely about the present, but about what was coming, and the accuracy of their prophecies was a central criterion for distinguishing true prophets from false ones. The Christian New Testament extends this tradition. The New Testament opens with anticipatory dreams shaping the life of Jesus. Joseph, the husband of Mary, receives a dream warning him to take the child Jesus to Egypt because Herod will try to kill him. The warning turns out to be accurate. The Magi receive a dream instructing them not to return to Herod after visiting the infant Jesus. That warning too proves accurate. Peter's vision on the rooftop in Acts anticipates the expansion of the gospel beyond Jewish communities. Paul's vision of a Macedonian man calling him to preach directs his missionary journey in ways he had not anticipated. The early Christian community took these anticipatory experiences with complete seriousness, treating them as communications that guided practical decisions with consequential outcomes. The theological frameworks for understanding these phenomena developed across the first several centuries of Christian history. Augustine of Hippo devoted attention to the question of how divine knowledge of the future relates to human knowledge of it. His position, which became standard in Western Christianity, held that God exists in eternity where all times are simultaneously present, and that specific human beings can sometimes, through grace, receive communications from this eternal perspective that reach their temporal awareness as knowledge of future events. The communications are not mechanical transmissions of information. They are gifts from the divine awareness that contains all times, offered to human beings who are receptive enough to receive them, and accurate enough in their discernment to distinguish genuine communications from psychological noise. The gift of prophecy, listed by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians as one of the charisms given to the early church, was understood as a genuine continuing capacity within Christian communities. The Apostolic Fathers, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the great medieval mystics, and specific figures across every subsequent century were reported to exhibit genuine prophetic capacity. The tradition developed sophisticated frameworks for evaluating prophetic claims. Specific prophecies had to come true to be recognized as genuine. False prophecy was recognized as a real danger, and criteria were developed for distinguishing reliable prophets from unreliable ones. The gift of counsel, another of the traditional 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit identified in the book of Isaiah and developed in Christian tradition, represents a different mode of anticipatory knowledge. Counsel is not prediction of specific future events, but rather the gift of knowing the right course of action in specific situations, which often involves knowing how things will unfold based on the choices that will be made. The distinction between prophecy and counsel captures something important. Genuine anticipatory knowledge often takes the form of guidance about what to do, rather than prediction of what will happen, regardless of what one does. The cultivated awareness perceives the shape of coming events closely enough to make wise choices about present action, without necessarily seeing specific details in advance. Medieval Christian saints produced extensive documented reports of anticipatory experience. The documentation of medieval saintly anticipatory capacity is extensive in the hagiographic literature. Catherine of Siena, writing in 14th century Italy, recorded visions that preceded specific events in the papal politics of her era. Joan of Arc, the 15th century French peasant whose visions directed her to lead armies that restored the French crown, reported future relevant information that she claimed came from saints. Her trial records document her claims in detail, and the accuracy of many of them has been a matter of historical debate ever since. Teresa of Avila, writing in 16th century Spain, described visions that sometimes contained anticipatory content, and her writings developed careful frameworks for discerning which visions were genuine and which were products of imagination. Padre Pio, the 20th century Italian stigmatist, provides a particularly well-documented case of sustained anticipatory capacity. Pio's life was extensively photographed, his statements recorded by multiple witnesses, and his specific anticipatory claims documented in letters and sworn affidavits by people who received his counsel. His reported ability to know details about people he had never met, to anticipate events in their lives, and to provide guidance that turned out to be accurate, was testified to by thousands of people across his decades of ministry. One documented case involves a woman who came to Pio seeking guidance about whether to marry a particular man. Pio reportedly told her, without meeting the man, specific details about his secret life that Pio could not have known through ordinary means, including the existence of another woman and a specific health condition. The information proved accurate when verified by the woman later. Similar cases accumulated across Pio's ministry, documented by the thousands. The evidence is not proof in any scientific sense. The cases were not controlled experiments, but the cumulative documentation is substantial and has been taken seriously even by skeptical investigators. The Orthodox Christian tradition has developed its own specific framework through the figure of the starets, the spiritual elder who, through decades of contemplative practice, develops capacities that include anticipatory knowledge. The starets tradition developed particularly in the Russian Orthodox Church, though it has antecedents in the earlier Byzantine and Athonite monastic traditions. A starets was understood as someone whose decades of contemplative practice had developed capacities that ordinary Christians did not possess. These included what the tradition called diakrisis, the power of spiritual discernment, along with related gifts that extended to anticipatory awareness. Seraphim of Sarov, the 18th century Russian starets, produced extensive documented reports of anticipatory awareness. Specific pilgrims received specific guidance from Seraphim about events that had not yet occurred, with details accurate enough that witnesses recorded them as evidence of genuine prophetic gift. The Philokalia, the 18th century compilation of Orthodox spiritual writings, contains extensive material on the cultivation of nous, the faculty of spiritual perception that includes anticipatory dimensions when sufficiently developed. The Christian practice of discernment, which we have examined across multiple investigations, provides the framework within which these anticipatory experiences are evaluated. Not every vision is genuine. Not every impression carries reliable information about the future. The tradition developed specific criteria for distinguishing genuine communications from psychological projections, from demonic deceptions, from wishful thinking. The criteria include the fruit the communication produces in the recipient's life, the alignment of the communication with established truth, the felt quality of the experience, and the corroboration that follows when predicted events either do or do not occur. Practitioners of discernment developed substantial skill in this work, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries of careful practice is available in the substantial literature the tradition has produced. The Jewish tradition, which shares with Christianity the prophetic heritage of the Hebrew Bible, developed its own ongoing framework for understanding prophetic capacity after the biblical period. The rabbinic tradition held that prophecy in the strict sense had ended with the destruction of the first temple, but that lesser forms of anticipatory perception called Bat Kol, the daughter of a voice, or Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, continued among righteous individuals. Medieval Jewish mysticism developed elaborate frameworks for understanding how such communications might operate. The Kabbalistic tradition, particularly through the Zohar composed in 13th century Spain, developed specific teachings about the relationship between time, consciousness, and the divine order that parallel in striking ways the teachings of other traditions we have examined. The Islamic tradition has placed special emphasis on anticipatory dream content. Muhammad's own documented dreams played roles in shaping the early Muslim community, with specific anticipatory content that was recorded and transmitted through the Hadith literature. The Prophet Muhammad is reported in Hadith to have said that the true dream is one of 46 parts of prophethood, a statement treating dreams as a genuine continuation of prophetic communication beyond the formal end of prophecy at Muhammad's death. The implication is that authentic, anticipatory content can continue to reach ordinary believers through dreams, even though the age of prophets has ended. The classic Islamic text on dream interpretation is Muhammad ibn Sirin's Tabir al-Ruya interpretation of dreams, compiled in the 8th century and serving as the standard reference in the Islamic world for over 1,000 years. Ibn Sirin's framework categorizes dreams into 3 types. The Ruya al-Salihah, the true or righteous dream, comes from God and contains authentic content that may include anticipatory material. The Hulum, the false dream, comes from Satan and contains content designed to disturb or deceive. The Adgatha Hlam, the confused dream, comes from the self and reflects the mental and emotional state of the dreamer without carrying external significance. Muhammad himself emphasized the importance of not sharing disturbing dreams widely, recommending that the dreamer spit 3 times to the left and seek refuge in God from what the dream may signify. This is not mere superstition. It reflects the tradition's understanding that false dreams hulum can produce psychological disturbance that the dreamer should not amplify by treating as significant. The task of dream interpretation involves determining which category a particular dream falls into, and specific criteria have been developed for making this determination with reliability. The signs of the true dream include several features. The dream carries a particular quality of clarity and coherence that distinguishes it from the confused dreams of ordinary sleep. The content is consistent with Islamic teaching and does not contradict established truth. The timing of the dream traditionally, dreams closer to dawn are considered more likely to be true dreams matters, though this is not a strict rule. The emotional quality of the dream persists into the waking state and continues to feel significant rather than dissolving into the haze of ordinary dream content. And the dream often involves specific imagery that the tradition recognizes as carrying particular meaning, which Ibn Sirin's extensive dream dictionary catalogues in detail. The Islamic scholars who developed this tradition across centuries include figures like Al-Ghazali, whose 11th century work, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, contains extensive material on dreams, prophecy, and the cultivation of anticipatory awareness through contemplative practice. Al-Ghazali, who had undergone a profound personal crisis that led him to abandon his distinguished academic career and spend years in Sufi practice, wrote from direct experience as well as theological analysis. Al-Ghazali argued that the heart, properly purified through Islamic practice, develops the capacity to receive communications that the ordinary intellect cannot reach. Some of these communications involve anticipatory content, though Al-Ghazali was careful to emphasize that reliable access to such content requires spiritual development that most ordinary believers have not attained. The Sufi tradition elaborated this framework with particular sophistication. Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Sufi metaphysician, developed detailed accounts of how the imaginal realm alam al-mithal operates in relation to the physical realm. The imaginal realm contains images, forms, and events that have their own reality but that exist in a different mode than physical reality. Ibn Arabi's metaphysical system, developed across over 300 works including the massive Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, distinguishes multiple levels of reality beyond the physical. The imaginal realm sits between the physical world and the realm of pure spirit, serving as the medium through which spiritual realities translate themselves into forms that human consciousness can perceive. Future events, in Ibn Arabi's framework, have reality in the imaginal realm before they manifest in the physical realm. Specific Sufi practitioners, through sustained contemplative practice, develop the capacity to access the imaginal realm and to perceive events there before they occur in the physical. The perception is not a violation of time. It is a shift in the ontological register from which the events are viewed. The Sufi tradition has produced some of the most profound poetry in world literature, and the poetry frequently touches on these themes. Rumi, in his poetry, articulated the experiential dimension of this teaching. "The minute I heard my first love story," Rumi writes, "I started looking for you, not knowing how blind that was. Lovers don't finally meet somewhere. They're in each other all along." The passage is not straightforwardly about premonition, but it captures something about how the traditional frameworks understand the relationship between past, present, and future. The temporal sequence that ordinary consciousness perceives is a surface feature of a deeper reality in which past, present, and future interpenetrate in ways that the surface perception does not reveal. The Hindu tradition has systematized the study of anticipatory capacity within the framework of the siddhis, the spiritual powers that emerge through sustained practice of yoga. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the foundational text of classical yoga from approximately the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, contains specific sutras addressing the capacity for knowledge of past and future. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras present a systematic path with 8 limbs, Ashtanga, progressing from ethical observances through physical practice, breathing, sensory withdrawal, concentration, meditation, and absorption, culminating in the liberated state. The 3rd chapter of the Yoga Sutras, called Vibhuti Pada, chapter on powers, catalogues the siddhis that emerge at the advanced stages. Sutra 3.16 describes the emergence of this capacity through samyama, the combined practice of concentration, meditation, and absorption focused on the 3 transformations of time. The capacity that emerges is called trikalajna, the knower of the 3 times, meaning past, present, and future. Patanjali's treatment is careful. The siddhis are real, but they are also spiritually dangerous if pursued for their own sake. The genuine goal of yoga is liberation, moksha, and the siddhis that emerge along the path are incidental rather than ultimate achievements. Practitioners who become attached to their siddhis miss the actual point of the practice and may fall back from progress they had made. But the siddhis are genuine. They emerge through specific practices. And the tradition has documented extensive reports of practitioners who exhibited the capacities that Patanjali describes. The word rishi comes from a Sanskrit root meaning to see. They were those who had seen the truths that they transmitted. The rishis of the Vedic tradition, the composers of the foundational Hindu scriptures, were traditionally understood to possess anticipatory capacity as one of their distinctive features. The specific teachings transmitted in the Vedas were received through visionary experience rather than invented through discursive reasoning, and the visionary experience included dimensions that transcended ordinary temporal perception. Subsequent generations of Hindu sages, from Shankara in the 8th century through Ramakrishna in the 19th and Ramana Maharshi in the 20th, have been reported to exhibit anticipatory capacities in documented cases that the tradition has preserved. The distinction between levels of access clarifies why premonition experiences vary so widely. The Hindu framework distinguishes levels of access to the anticipatory dimension. At the lowest level, ordinary people occasionally experience spontaneous premonitions through dreams, intuitions, or sudden impressions. At intermediate levels, practitioners develop more reliable access through cultivated capacities. At the highest levels, fully liberated beings access the trikalajna capacity directly, perceiving past, present, and future as features of a single unified awareness rather than as sequential moments. The levels represent not different quantities of the same capacity but different qualities of access, with the highest level involving a fundamental shift in the nature of the perceiving consciousness itself. The Buddhist tradition has developed its own framework for understanding anticipatory capacity, though with a specific emphasis that differs from the Hindu approach. The Buddhist tradition lists 6 abhijnas or higher knowledges that can emerge through advanced practice. These include psychic powers, divine ear, hearing beyond ordinary range, knowledge of others' minds, knowledge of past lives, and knowledge of the future. The last of these, called Dibakaku, or divine eye, includes the capacity to see events that have not yet occurred. The tradition provides specific accounts of the Buddha exercising this capacity. The Buddha himself, according to traditional accounts, exercised this capacity during his awakening under the Bodhi tree, perceiving the karmic destinies of all beings across the vast extent of time. The tradition records the Buddha making predictions about individuals during his 45 years of teaching, anticipating deaths, recognizing past life connections, and guiding decisions based on what he perceived about the likely trajectories of situations. The abhijnas are traditionally listed in specific Pali and Sanskrit sources, with documented accounts of each capacity appearing across the canonical literature. The Samanaphala Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, one of the foundational texts of Theravada Buddhism, describes these capacities as fruits that emerge through sustained meditative practice. The tradition distinguishes between the first 5, which are called mundane, meaning they can be developed through concentration practice without necessarily producing liberation, and the 6th, which is the knowledge of the destruction of the mental defilements and which constitutes liberation itself. Anticipatory knowledge falls among the mundane abhijnas, meaning it can develop in practitioners who have not yet achieved full liberation but who have developed sufficient concentration capacity. The Buddhist treatment of these capacities parallels the Hindu treatment in important respects. The capacities are real, but they are not the point of the practice. The point is liberation from suffering through insight into the true nature of reality. Practitioners who become attached to the abhijnas miss the actual goal, and the tradition has developed extensive warnings about this attachment. But within the framework of the tradition, the capacities are treated as genuine phenomena that emerge through genuine practice and that provide evidence of the reality of what the tradition teaches about the nature of consciousness and time. Tibetan Buddhism has preserved practices aimed at cultivating these capacities, particularly within the Tantric and Dzogchen traditions. The practice of divination through mo, a ritual consultation using dice or mala beads, has been used for centuries to seek anticipatory guidance about specific questions. The Dalai Lamas have traditionally consulted oracles who enter trance states to deliver predictive information, a practice that continues to the present day. The Nechong oracle, traditionally consulted by the Dalai Lama on matters of state, enters trance states in which the oracle's body is understood to be possessed by a protective deity who speaks through him. The phenomenon has been witnessed and documented extensively, though its mechanism remains debated. The indigenous traditions across the world have cultivated anticipatory capacity through practices adapted to cultural contexts. The shamanic traditions of North and South America, Siberia, and Africa include extensive techniques for accessing what the traditions describe as spirit communications that include anticipatory content. Vision quests, sweat lodges, plant medicines, and ritual drumming are among the methods developed for inducing the altered states in which anticipatory information becomes accessible. The documented ethnographic literature contains extensive reports of indigenous practitioners exhibiting genuine anticipatory capacity in contexts that the conventional framework cannot easily accommodate. The Celtic tradition of Britain and Ireland preserved a form of anticipatory perception called the second sight, or taib seracht in Gaelic. The capacity was reported particularly in the Scottish Highlands, where particular individuals in particular families were known to exhibit it across generations. The second sight typically manifested as visions of coming events, particularly deaths and disasters, appearing to the seer as vivid waking visions that had the quality of ordinary perception, but that no one else present could see. The second sight was considered an involuntary gift rather than a cultivated capacity. Those who possessed it often found it a burden, as the visions of coming deaths and disasters disturbed their ordinary lives. The capacity was said to run in particular families, and specific seers were known throughout the Highlands by name and reputation. Their anticipatory pronouncements were taken seriously by communities that had observed their accuracy over lifetimes of testing. Extensive documentation of these experiences was collected in the 17th and 18th centuries by figures like Robert Kirk, whose 1691 manuscript, The Secret Commonwealth, catalogued the phenomenon in detail. The Norse tradition preserved similar practices through figures called vulva seeresses, who practiced a form of anticipatory perception called sidra. The Eddic poetry describes Odin himself consulting a vulva in the Voluspa, seeking information about coming events. The practice was well established in pre-Christian Scandinavia and persisted in various forms into the historical period. The Taoist tradition in China developed its own distinctive approach to anticipatory awareness through the cultivation of what the tradition calls Ming, a specific kind of clarity that emerges through sustained practice of stillness and inner attention. The classical Taoist texts, including the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, describe sages who, through the cultivation of emptiness and receptivity, develop the capacity to perceive the shape of things before they fully manifest. The I Ching, the foundational Chinese divination text, provided a systematic methodology for consulting this anticipatory dimension through casting configurations that revealed the character of unfolding situations. Confucian scholars integrated I Ching consultation into official governance for over 2,000 years, treating it not as folk superstition but as a legitimate method for accessing information about coming developments. The Greek oracular tradition provided what may be the most institutionally developed form of anticipatory consultation in the ancient world. The oracle at Delphi, operating from the 8th century BCE until late antiquity, provided predictive pronouncements that kings, generals, and ordinary citizens consulted on matters of importance. The Pythia, the priestess who delivered the oracles, entered altered states during the ritual. The historical records from multiple Greek authors describe the Pythia entering a specific altered state during the ritual consultation. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi during the 1st century CE, described gases rising from a crack in the rock beneath the temple's inner sanctum. These descriptions were long dismissed as mythological by classical scholars. Then in the late 1990s, geologists Jella de Boer and John Hale documented that the temple sits above the intersection of two specific fault lines that release hydrocarbon gases, including ethylene, a gas that, in controlled doses, produces exactly the process, psychoactive effects that ancient sources described for the Pythia. The inhalation of volcanic gases that recent geological research has documented emerging from the spot where the Delphic tripod stood. Her pronouncements were famously ambiguous, requiring interpretation, but they were treated with profound seriousness by Greek civilization for over a millennium. The accumulated evidence across these traditions points to a specific conclusion. Anticipatory capacity is a real dimension of human consciousness, documented across cultures that had no contact with each other, developed through methodologies that show remarkable structural parallels despite superficial cultural differences. The phenomenon is not a product of cultural expectations that create the appearance of premonition through the power of suggestion. It is a structural feature of human consciousness that cultural frameworks have developed specific methodologies for engaging. This structural convergence across traditions constitutes what philosophers call the perennial philosophy argument. The observation that major contemplative traditions that developed independently across vast distances of geography and time nevertheless converge on structurally similar claims about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the human condition. The convergence across traditions reveals something important about the phenomenon itself. Every tradition that has systematically engaged anticipatory knowledge has reached similar conclusions about its nature. The capacity is real. The capacity is more accessible in altered states than in ordinary waking consciousness. The capacity can be cultivated through sustained practice. The capacity produces more reliable information when the practitioner is morally and spiritually developed than when they are not. The information accessed is more about meaning and general shape than about specific details. The moral quality of the perceiver matters to the quality of the perception, not as a magical reward system, but as a reflection of the fact that the capacity for accurate anticipatory perception requires the kind of psychological integration that ethical development produces. A person in chaos projects their chaos onto what they perceive. A person at peace can perceive more clearly what is actually there. An attachment to the capacity for its own sake tends to undermine the practice that made it accessible. These convergent findings deserve attention. They are not the product of cultural borrowing. The traditions developed independently across vast geographical and temporal distances. They are not the product of physical or neurological mechanisms that would produce similar results in any human being. Regardless of training, the capacities require development that not everyone achieves. They appear, instead, to be the product of genuine engagement with a real phenomenon, whose features reveal themselves consistently to careful investigators, regardless of their cultural context. These are not the conclusions of people who fail to understand probability and coincidence. They are the conclusions of contemplative investigators who engage the phenomenon with sustained attention across generations, developing discriminatory frameworks that allowed them to separate reliable from unreliable anticipatory content. Their conclusions deserve the same respect we would give to any investigative community whose methods had produced consistent, convergent findings. The fourth part of this investigation will bring everything together. We will examine the practical implications of the framework the investigations have developed. We will consider how ordinary people can relate to their own anticipatory experiences in ways that neither dismiss them as meaningless nor treat them as reliable guidance without discrimination. We will examine the tradition's practices for cultivating the capacity and for distinguishing genuine anticipatory content from noise. And we will close with a consideration of what it means, for your own experience of time, that the future is not quite as inaccessible as ordinary consciousness takes it to be. The phenomenon of premonition presents a challenge that conventional physics cannot address. Information about future events appearing to reach present consciousness would seem to require signals traveling backward in time, which the standard causal structure of physics appears to forbid. Entropy increases over time. The second law of thermodynamics points forward. Every practical experience of time confirms this apparent flow from past to future. Causes precede effects. Effects follow causes, not the other way around. And any mechanism that would allow the future to reach back and inform the present would seem to violate principles so deep in physics that taking the phenomenon seriously requires, on its face, rejecting physics entirely. This appearance is misleading. The conventional picture of time and causation, which ordinary experience takes for granted, is not the picture that contemporary physics actually supports. The physics at its deepest level, as revealed by a century of careful experimental work and increasingly refined theoretical analysis, is substantially more strange than common sense suggests. And within that strangeness lies a range of mechanisms that could, in principle, accommodate the anticipatory phenomena that the research has documented. The task of this investigation is to examine those mechanisms carefully. The first relevant framework is the block universe interpretation of relativity, which we have encountered in previous investigations but which bears direct application here. Einstein's special and general theories of relativity, verified through countless experiments over more than a century, produce a picture of time that differs fundamentally from the picture of ordinary experience. In relativity, simultaneity is not absolute. Two events that appear simultaneous to one observer may not appear simultaneous to another observer moving at a different velocity. The notion of a universal present that distinguishes what has happened from what will happen does not hold up mathematically. What remains is a four-dimensional structure spacetime within which all events have their locations, and within which the apparent flow of time is a feature of how observers traverse the structure rather than a feature of the structure itself. This picture, which Minkowski articulated in 1908 and which has been developed through many hands since, carries a specific implication for the status of the future. If space-time is a unified four-dimensional structure, then all events within it, past, present and future, have equal ontological standing. The events we call future are not non-existent events waiting to come into being. They are events located at specific coordinates in the structure, with full reality at those coordinates, differing from the events we call present only in their temporal position relative to the observer. Einstein himself reached the most famous articulation of this view in a letter written to the family of his lifelong friend Michel Bessot in March 1955, weeks before his own death. For us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. The statement was not a theological consolation offered to grieving survivors. It was the considered position of the physicist who had done more than anyone to transform our understanding of time, expressed at the end of his life in the most direct form he had ever given it. Hermann Weyl, the mathematical physicist who helped develop the modern understanding of relativity, expressed this with characteristic precision. The objective world simply is, it does not happen, only to the gaze of my consciousness, crawling upward along the world line of my body, does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space which continuously changes in time. The objective world is the four-dimensional block. The flow of time is a phenomenon of consciousness traversing that block. And the future, within this framework, is not a blank waiting to be filled in. It is a specific region of the block with specific content, already real, already there. The Riet-Dyke-Putnam argument, which we examined in the Fate investigation, formalizes this conclusion. Using the relativity of simultaneity, the argument establishes that events arbitrarily far in the future of any particular observer can be made simultaneous with the present moment from some valid perspective. If events simultaneous with the present are real, and denying this seems to require collapsing all meaningful distinctions between reality and unreality, then events in the future of any specific observer are real. The future exists. The only question is what mechanisms might allow information from that future to reach present awareness. The most promising mechanism involves retrocausality, the possibility that later events can influence earlier ones. Hugh Price, the philosopher of physics at Cambridge, has argued across a series of books and papers that retrocausal interpretations of quantum mechanics actually provide the most natural solution to several persistent puzzles in quantum foundations. Price's argument is that the strangeness of quantum mechanics, the non-locality that Bell's theorem demonstrates, the apparent dependence of past behavior on future measurements can all be handled coherently if we simply accept that quantum systems involve retrocausal influence at the fundamental level. Most physicists have been reluctant to accept this conclusion because retrocausality violates deep intuitions about the temporal asymmetry of causation. But the intuitions may be wrong, in Price's view, and the physics would become simpler if we set them aside. Retrocausality sounds, on first encounter, like a violation of basic physics. But retrocausal influence at the quantum level has been experimentally demonstrated repeatedly in ways that are no longer controversial within physics, even if their full interpretation remains debated. John Archibald Wheeler proposed the foundational thought experiment in the late 1970s. Consider the standard double-slit experiment. A photon passes through a barrier with two slits and produces an interference pattern on a detection screen, behaving like a wave. If a detector is placed at the slits to determine which slit the photon passed through, the interference pattern disappears and the photon behaves like a particle. Wheeler asked, what happens if the decision about whether to measure the slit is made after the photon has already passed through the apparatus? Does the photon's earlier behavior depend on a measurement choice that has not yet been made? Yoon-Ho Kim and his collaborators performed the decisive experimental version of this thought experiment, published in Physical Review Letters in 2000. Using entangled photon pairs, Kim's team created an arrangement in which the choice of what to measure on one photon was made after the other photon had already been detected. The experimental design deserves attention. One photon from an entangled pair, the signal went through a double-slit apparatus. The other, the idler, went to a set of detectors that could, depending on experimental choice, either preserve or erase information about which slit the signal photon had passed through. The critical feature, the choice of what to do with the idler, could be made after the signal photon had already been detected. If the idler measurement preserved which slit information, the signal photon had behaved as a particle. If it erased the information, the signal photon had behaved as a wave. The choice was made afterward. The behavior was determined beforehand. The results were unambiguous. The measurement choice made after the fact determined the behavior that the earlier photon had already exhibited. Later events shaped earlier events. The temporal order that classical physics assumes that causes precede effects does not hold at the quantum level. The physics is consistent. Relativity is not violated. No signal travels backward in time to carry information. But the correlations between events run in both temporal directions, and the apparent causation, when examined carefully, flows from future to past as well as from past to future. The transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, developed by John Cramer at the University of Washington beginning in 1986, provides a theoretical framework within which these phenomena become intuitive rather than paradoxical. Cramer proposed that quantum events are not simple sequential processes, but handshakes between past and future. An emitter produces an offer wave that propagates forward in time. An absorber produces a confirmation wave that propagates backward in time. The quantum event, the actualization of a particular outcome, occurs when these two waves meet, forming a completed transaction between the emitter in the past and the absorber in the future. The framework has substantial explanatory power. The EPR correlations that Einstein found so troubling, the delayed choice phenomena that Wheeler proposed and Kim confirmed, the apparent non-locality of quantum mechanics, all of these become intuitive when quantum events are understood as transactions rather than as unidirectional causal chains. Cramer developed the framework across several papers in the 1980s, building on earlier work by Wheeler and Feynman on the absorber theory of radiation. The transactional picture restores a kind of realism to quantum mechanics. The specific outcomes are not merely probabilistic collapses, but determinate transactions whose conditions are specified at both ends of their temporal. The extent. The interpretation is not the dominant one in physics. The Copenhagen interpretation and the many worlds interpretation have more adherents, but it remains a serious option within the landscape of quantum interpretations, defended by physicists who find its explanatory power compelling. Yakir Aharonov, who was a student of David Bohm and who has been a leading figure in quantum foundations for over 60 years, has developed a related framework called the two-state vector formalism. In Aharonov's two-state vector formalism, the quantum state at any moment is determined not only by the past preparation of the system but also by the future measurement that will be performed. Present physical reality, in Aharonov's framework, is the intersection of past conditions and future conditions. The past shapes the present through ordinary causation. The future shapes the present through what Aharonov calls post-selection. Both temporal directions contribute to what physically occurs at any given moment. Aharonov's framework has produced specific experimental predictions that have been confirmed in laboratory work. The weak measurement protocols that his group developed allow researchers to extract information about quantum systems without collapsing them, revealing features that depend on both past preparation and future measurement. A weak measurement extracts a small amount of information from a quantum system without fully collapsing it, allowing the system to continue evolving toward its eventual strong measurement. When these weak values are analyzed, they can take unusual values, sometimes negative, sometimes lying outside the range that ordinary observables can take, which reflects the contribution of the future measurement to the present weak reading. These weak values have been measured in experiments at multiple laboratories. They provide empirical evidence that the two-state vector formalism captures something real about how quantum reality operates. The two-state vector formalism has produced increasingly sophisticated empirical tests. Aharonov's group at Tel Aviv has collaborated with experimentalists in Toronto, Rome, and elsewhere on weak measurement protocols that probe the two-state structure with increasing precision. The picture that emerges from these experiments is of a quantum reality that genuinely does operate with contributions from both temporal directions, at least at the statistical level where the experiments can detect the influence. The implication for the phenomena of premonition is substantial. If quantum events involve contributions from both temporal directions, and if consciousness is in some way grounded in or involved with quantum processes, then the ordinary direction of information flow from past to present may not exhaust the informational possibilities. Information about future events may reach present consciousness through channels that operate at the quantum level and that the ordinary macroscopic framework does not describe. This is not a minor adjustment to physics. It is a major reconfiguration of how we understand the causal structure of reality. But the reconfiguration is not an invention to accommodate premonition. It is already implicit in the best confirmed physics of the 20th century. The premonition phenomena are not in principle impossible. They are consistent with mechanisms that the physics itself contains, even if the standard interpretations have tended to emphasize the past to future direction of causation. Before proceeding to the biological question, one important clarification. No signaling theorems in quantum mechanics establish that retrocausal correlations cannot be used to transmit classical information backward in time. You cannot build a device that lets you send a message to your past self. The retrocausal influences operate at the statistical level, producing correlations between measurement outcomes that require both past and future contributions to explain, but never allowing controllable signals to propagate backward in time. This is consistent with special relativity and prevents the paradoxes that controlled retrocausal signaling would create. What the framework permits is much more subtle anticipatory correlations that can only be recognized after the fact, that carry information about what will happen, but not under conditions that allow reliable control over future events. The question then becomes, what conditions would make these retrocausal channels operative in biological systems? The answer involves the same mechanisms that have been developed across the other investigations. The orchestrated objective reduction theory of Penrose and Hameroff proposes that quantum processes operate in the microtubules of neurons, with specific objective reduction events corresponding to moments of conscious experience. If these quantum processes involve the retrocausal features that the transactional and two-state vector frameworks describe, then consciousness would be operating at a level where past and future contribute simultaneously to the informational content of experience. This is the picture that Einstein articulated, in less technical language, across the last decades of his life. Time, in its ordinary appearance as something that flows, is an illusion of consciousness traversing the block. The apparent forward flow of time would be a feature of how the integrated macroscopic experience unfolds, while the underlying quantum substrate operates in both directions. The microtubules are cylindrical protein structures that form the cytoskeleton of every neuron. They are not merely structural scaffolding. Penrose and Hameroff argued that they host specific quantum processes that contribute to consciousness. The theory has been controversial since its introduction in the 1990s, with critics arguing that the warm, wet, the noisy environment of the brain should destroy quantum coherence too quickly for it to play a meaningful role in neural function. Bandyopadhyay's 2022 experimental findings on quantum coherence in microtubules provide empirical support for the theoretical proposal that quantum processes are operating in neural tissue. If these processes are retrocausally sensitive, then the premonition findings become mechanistically coherent. Information about events that have not yet occurred could reach consciousness, because the neural substrate of perception operates at a quantum level where future events are already contributing to the present structure of awareness. The documented premonition cases, viewed through this framework, take on a coherent interpretation. The child who dreamed of her school being covered by something black before the coal slurry collapsed was not generating content from nothing. The dreaming mind was accessing information that was already present in the quantum substrate where the coming event was already contributing to the structure of reality. The president who dreamed of his own coffin in the East Room before his assassination was not imagining a random scenario. The information about the coming event, already real at its location in the block universe, was reaching his awareness through the relaxed filtering of the dream state. The pattern across thousands of documented cases is consistent with the physics, even if the physics required to accommodate it is more strange than classical intuition suggests. The empathic premonition cases, the mother who wakes at the moment her distant child has an accident, the partner who knows across continents that the loved one has died, become similarly interpretable. The non-local connections between consciousnesses that have been emotionally entangled through shared history extend through time as well as through space. The information about what is happening, or what is about to happen, to the loved one reaches the experiencer through channels that the ordinary framework excludes, but that quantum non-locality permits. The perception is not an impossible signal traveling backward in time. It is participation in a shared informational structure that includes contributions from both temporal directions. This is a startling picture of what human consciousness actually is, but it is a picture that follows directly from taking the physics seriously. The research on precognitive dreams takes its place within this framework. REM sleep involves specific features that may be relevant. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which provides rational modulation during waking consciousness, is largely deactivated. The default mode network operates differently than during waking, and the subjective experience of time during dreams does not match clock time. Events that feel hours long can occur in minutes of actual sleep time. If consciousness during dream state operates with different relationships to temporal sequence than it does during waking, then accessing anticipatory information may be substantially easier during sleep. The sleeping brain, with its relaxed ordinary filtering, becomes capable of accessing informational content that waking consciousness does not ordinarily reach. Some of this content comes from past memory, some from other conscious beings through non-local connections, and some, the precognitive content that the research has documented, comes from future events that are already contributing to the quantum substrate that the sleeping consciousness can access more fully than the waking. Mind. Boehm's implicate order framework provides another angle on these phenomena. Boehm proposed that the explicate order of ordinary experience, separate objects, sequential events, causal chains running from past to future unfolds from an implicate order that contains the undivided wholeness from which the explicate is generated. The implicate order is not temporally sequential in the way the explicate is. Past, present, and future coexist within the implicate as features of a single unified structure. The unfolding into the explicate produces the apparent temporal sequence, but the deeper reality contains all times in a unified form. This framework makes sense of the premonition phenomena in a specific way. When consciousness accesses the implicate order through specific altered states, through sleep, through contemplative practice, through whatever mechanisms allow the interface to relax, the access is not limited to the explicate present. The implicate contains past, present, and future as aspects of a single unified reality, and access to the implicate can deliver information from any temporal region. Boehm's framework, developed across several decades of his life and expressed most fully in wholeness and the implicate order, proposed that the universe we perceive is an unfolding of a deeper reality that contains all times and all places, in an enfolded form. The explicate order is what gets unfolded, the implicate order is what does the unfolding, and consciousness, in Boehm's view, is not simply a feature of the explicate brain, but participates directly in the implicate order from which the brain itself unfolds. Premonition is not a violation of the explicate order's causal flow. It is access to a deeper order in which the temporal sequence of the explicate has not yet been imposed. The connection to the broader framework of these investigations is direct. The investigations that preceded this one provide the foundation on which the premonition picture rests. The memory investigation established that the past persists. The fate investigation established that the future exists. The laws of existence investigation established the structural principles observation creates reality. Nothing is separate. Information cannot be destroyed. Premonition is not an isolated oddity. It is one phenomenon within the broader picture that these investigations have been building. The future exists. Information about the future is, in principle, accessible. The framework coheres, and the biological and neurological mechanisms that actualize specific instances of this access are beginning to be understood in terms that contemporary physics can accommodate. The question of why premonitions occur to particular individuals at particular moments, rather than flooding every person continuously with anticipatory information, deserves attention. The answer appears to involve several factors. Emotional significance plays a major role. The events that most commonly appear in premonitions are emotionally charged deaths, disasters, major transitions, intense personal experiences. Mundane events rarely appear. Researchers have speculated about why emotional intensity matters. One hypothesis is that strongly charged events produce stronger distortions in the informational substrate, making them more detectable to consciousness. Another hypothesis is that evolution has selected for biological mechanisms that preferentially access information about survival-relevant situations, which tend to be emotionally intense. A third hypothesis is that the conscious mind filters incoming anticipatory information based on relevance, discarding mundane future events and preserving only those that matter enough to warrant attention. This suggests that the signal-to-noise ratio is substantially higher for high-stakes content, either because such events carry more energetic significance in the quantum substrate, or because the biological filtering system preferentially allows such content through. Relational proximity also plays a major role. Premonitions about people close to the experiencer occur at much higher rates than premonitions about strangers. This pattern suggests that the non-local connections between individuals, grounded in shared history or genuine emotional bond, provide the channels through which anticipatory information flows. Mothers report premonitions about their children at rates that dwarf premonitions about distant acquaintances. Twins, particularly identical twins, report correlated experiences at rates that the general population does not approach. Long-term romantic partners report crisis knowledge about each other during periods of separation. The entangled state of closely connected consciousnesses may extend through time as well as through space, carrying information about the future states of connected individuals to their present partners. The state of consciousness at the moment of reception appears to matter substantially. Consciousness state matters. Premonitions occur more readily during sleep, during meditative states, during moments of deep relaxation, and during transitions between consciousness states than during ordinary waking activity. The ordinary waking state, with its strong rational filtering, appears to suppress the anticipatory channels. States in which the filtering relaxes dreams, trance states, the moments immediately before sleep and immediately after waking, provide better conditions for anticipatory content to reach awareness. Individual capacity varies substantially across the population. The population studies suggest that approximately 5 to 10% of people report frequent premonition experiences, meaning multiple instances per year that they consider accurate. Most people report occasional experiences. Some people report frequent premonition experiences. Most people report occasional ones. A few people appear to be resistant or unable to access this channel entirely. Interestingly, people who are highly analytical, highly left-brain dominant in their cognitive style, and highly resistant to the possibility of non-ordinary experience tend to report fewer premonitions than others. Whether this reflects genuine individual variation in capacity or reflects differences in how such experiences are recognized and reported remains an open question. The factors that determine individual capacity are not fully understood, but they appear to include both innate sensitivity and cultivated skill. This has practical implications for how to relate to one's own premonition experiences. Discounting every apparent premonition as coincidence denies real information that may be available. Acting on every apparent premonition as if it were reliable knowledge leads to excessive caution, missed opportunities, and eventual disconnection from reality. The sensible path runs between these extremes. Contemplative traditions across cultures have specific practices for developing the capacity, and sustained practitioners of these traditions report substantial increases in anticipatory capacity over years of training. The ethical implications of all this deserve brief consideration before we proceed. If premonitions are real, then the information they carry sometimes warrants action. The person who dreams of a plane crash and cancels their flight may save their life. The person who feels a sudden dread before driving on a particular day may avoid a fatal accident. But the information is rarely complete, rarely specific enough to produce clear guidance, and rarely reliable enough to justify major decisions. The tradition of distinguishing genuine premonitions from ordinary anxiety, which is central to Islamic dream interpretation, to Christian discernment, to Buddhist analysis of mental states, has developed precisely because untrained intuition about the future produces a high rate of false positives that cannot be responsibly acted upon. The framework suggests an attitude that is neither credulous nor dismissive. Take the experiences seriously as potentially meaningful. Do not dismiss them as mere coincidence or anxious projection, but also do not treat them as reliable guidance for every decision. The history of premonition traditions is full of warnings about over-reliance on anticipatory content. The Christian Desert Fathers warned against seeking visions of the future, which they considered spiritually dangerous even when the visions were genuine. The Buddhist tradition regards prophetic capacities as incidental to the main work of liberation, not as spiritual achievements to pursue for their own sake. The Islamic tradition warns specifically against the false prophet who claims reliable knowledge of the future beyond what is given. These warnings reflect accumulated wisdom about the limits of anticipatory capacity. The most reliable cultivation practice, consistent across traditions, begins with documentation. Document premonitions when they occur, noting the content and context before any events could have occurred to which they might correspond. Observe over time whether your premonitions tend to be accurate or not, recognizing that accuracy develops with cultivation and that honest tracking is necessary to distinguish genuine capacity from selective memory. Learn to distinguish the felt quality of genuine premonition, which experienced practitioners describe as carrying a specific tone of arriving, rather than being constructed from the felt quality of ordinary anxiety. The physics permits premonition. The biology accommodates it. The research field is still relatively small, underfunded compared to conventional psychology, and viewed with skepticism by mainstream scientists. But the research exists. It has produced findings. The findings are not consistent with the assumption that premonition is entirely imaginary. The research documents it in carefully controlled conditions. The contemplative traditions have been cultivating it for thousands of years. The third part of this investigation will engage those traditions in depth, examining the frameworks that Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, and indigenous traditions have developed for understanding and engaging anticipatory knowledge. The traditions were not confused about the phenomenon. They recognized it, catalogued it, cultivated it, and developed specific methodologies for distinguishing reliable, anticipatory content from the noise that can mimic it. Their sustained engagement with this territory produced vocabularies, practices, and discriminatory frameworks that modern dismissive approaches have simply forgotten. Their accumulated wisdom, when integrated with the contemporary physics, produces a framework that neither the physics nor the traditions alone could produce. Not reachable in the sense of being controllable, not reachable in the sense of being available for reliable, detailed prediction, but reachable in the sense that information about it does sometimes cross into present awareness through channels that the conventional framework excludes, but that the extended framework can begin to describe. The future is reachable. The traditions show us how. The physics tells us that premonition does not require breaking the rules of reality. It requires recognizing that the rules of reality are substantially different from what common sense suggests, and that within those rules, anticipatory knowledge has a place that modern dismissal has obscured, but that the investigations across this channel have been patiently reconstructing. 3 investigations into what happens when consciousness encounters information about events that have not yet occurred. The documented cases from history, from Eryl Mai Jones's dream of Aberfan, through Lincoln's vision of his own coffin, through Mark Twain's dream of his brother's funeral, through thousands of similar instances that the historical record preserves. The quantum physics providing a framework within which retrocausal influence operates at the fundamental level of reality. The contemplative traditions accumulating thousands of years of sustained engagement with anticipatory capacity, developing methodologies that modern dismissive accounts have forgotten, but that the convergent findings of the research are beginning to recover. And the convergence produces a picture that transforms what you do with your own anticipatory experiences, how you understand them, and what it means that the future is not quite as closed as ordinary consciousness takes it to be. The research established the empirical ground. Louisa Rhine at Duke collected 10,000 spontaneous cases, whose patterns reveal the consistent structure of the phenomenon across the general population. The Maimonides Dream Laboratory produced statistical evidence for dream content corresponding to targets that had not yet been selected when the dreams occurred. Documented case collections from disasters including Aberfan and the Titanic accumulated evidence that specific events had been perceived by specific individuals before those events took place. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, by serious scholars, including the philosopher Henry Sidgwick and the physicist William Barrett accumulated thousands of carefully investigated cases across decades of systematic work. The accumulated historical and modern documentation constitutes a body of evidence substantial enough that dismissive approaches cannot comfortably account for what it contains. The research is not conclusive in the way that gravitation research is conclusive. It is suggestive in ways that the conventional framework cannot easily dismiss, and that a serious investigation must take into account. The physics provided the theoretical framework. Einstein and Minkowski established that all events in spacetime have equal ontological standing. The future exists at its coordinates, as surely as the past does. Wheeler's delayed choice thought experiments and Kim's decisive 2000 experimental confirmation showed that retrocausal influence operates at the quantum level, with later measurements determining earlier behavior. Cramer's transactional interpretation and Aharonov's two-state vector formalism provided theoretical frameworks within which these phenomena become intuitive rather than paradoxical. Hugh Price argued that retrocausality offers the most natural solution to several persistent puzzles in quantum foundations. The physics permits premonition. It does not require signals traveling backward in time. It requires only that the fundamental structure of reality includes contributions from both temporal directions, and this requirement is already met by the best confirmed physics we possess. The traditions provided the practical wisdom. The Christian engagement with prophecy and counsel preserved across 2 millennia of systematic work. The Islamic framework of 3 dream categories, developed by Ibn Sirin and elaborated across 14 centuries. The Hindu siddhis, catalogued by Patanjali and refined across generations of yogic practice. The Buddhist abhijnas, documented in the Pali Canon and engaged by generations of meditators. The Jewish Ruach HaKodesh, the Taoist Ming, the indigenous vision quests, the Celtic second sight, the Greek oracles. Every tradition converged on similar conclusions about the nature of the phenomenon and the conditions under which it becomes reliably accessible. The convergence is itself evidence of substantial weight that honest inquiry must take into account. Now, let us confront the objections. The first objection is the confirmation bias objection. What looks like premonition is actually confirmation bias, the selective remembering of experiences that happen to match subsequent events, combined with the forgetting of experiences that did not. Everyone has dreams, intuitions, and sudden impressions throughout their lives. A small percentage of these will, by coincidence alone, correspond to subsequent events. The mind remembers the matches and forgets the misses, producing the illusion of a pattern that is not actually present in the underlying data. This objection has real force for many individual reports. It applies less clearly to the cases that were documented in advance with independent witness corroboration. When the dream is recorded before the anticipated event, written in a letter, told to multiple witnesses, filed with an investigator like Barker of the British Premonitions Bureau, the confirmation bias explanation loses its grip. The record exists before the event. Memory reconstruction cannot manufacture content that was already written down. The Lincoln Dream, documented in his friend Lamont's memoir with the specific date of the conversation. The Eryl Mai Jones dream, told to her mother and to other family members the morning before the disaster. Joan of Arc's predictions, recorded by witnesses who heard her describe them in advance and then watched them occur. The British Premonitions Bureau's documented hits, filed before the events they anticipated. The confirmation bias explanation works for some reports. It does not work for cases with advanced documentation and witness corroboration, and those cases accumulate across centuries into a body of evidence substantial enough that the dismissive framework struggles to fully address it. The second objection is the variability objection. The documented cases vary enormously in their specific features. Some involve dreams that match subsequent events with uncanny precision. Others involve vague impressions that only in retrospect seem to match what occurred. Some involve mundane personal events. Others involve major historical catastrophes. The variability makes systematic investigation difficult. The phenomenon does not present itself in a form that allows reliable replication or controlled prediction. This is a genuine limitation. Any serious framework must acknowledge that the capacity, if it exists, does not operate under the conditions that would allow scientific taming in the ordinary sense. The phenomenon is real, but it is also genuinely irregular, and any framework that promises reliable access to specific future information overpromises what the evidence supports. This objection captures something important. The laboratory research demonstrates a small, robust, but limited anticipatory effect in ordinary subjects who have not undergone specific contemplative training. The traditions claim something much larger, that sustained practice can develop the capacity into a reliable channel of anticipatory knowledge. These are different claims, and the evidence for them is different. The laboratory evidence does not establish the tradition's claims. The tradition's evidence is the accumulated testimony of practitioners across cultures and centuries, which the laboratory framework cannot easily evaluate. The serious position recognizes that both bodies of evidence exist, that they point in similar directions without being equivalent, and that a complete picture requires taking both seriously without overstating what either establishes on its own. The third objection is the spiritual bypass objection. Taking premonition seriously, even in the attenuated form the laboratory research documents, risks producing a spiritual bypass, a substitution of magical thinking for psychological work. People who come to believe they can predict the future through their intuitions often develop anxiety disorders, make consequential decisions based on unreliable impressions, and use the belief to avoid the rational engagement with uncertainty that adult life requires. The framework, even if theoretically correct, may produce practical harm by encouraging a style of relating to the future that undermines, rather than supports, psychological well-being. This objection deserves careful attention because it points at a real risk that contemplative traditions themselves have consistently warned about. The Christian Desert Fathers warned against seeking visions. The Buddhist tradition warned against attachment to the siddhis. The Islamic tradition warned against false prophets and the psychological harm of over-reliance on dreams. The frameworks did not encourage indiscriminate trust in anticipatory impressions. They encouraged careful discernment, distinguishing reliable from unreliable content, developing the psychological stability that allows sustained engagement with uncertainty, and maintaining humility about the limits of one's own anticipatory capacity. The risk the objection identifies is real. The framework does not encourage the behavior that produces the risk. It encourages the opposite, the cultivated discernment that the traditions developed precisely to prevent the misuse of anticipatory capacity. A fourth objection deserves mention before we proceed. It is the demonic influence objection, articulated most fully in the Christian and Islamic traditions. The objection holds that anticipatory experiences may be genuine, but may also be produced by deceptive forces seeking to mislead the experiencer. Not every dream that comes true is a gift from God. Some predictions come from sources that have their own agendas, providing accurate information on small matters to build trust that can then be exploited on larger matters. The Christian Desert Fathers warned that demons can predict some future events, because their non-temporal perspective permits them partial access that they use manipulatively. The Islamic tradition makes the same distinction through its framework of true dreams versus deceptive dreams. This objection lies outside what empirical research can directly evaluate. The frameworks that articulate it come from within religious traditions that make metaphysical claims the laboratory cannot test. But the practical wisdom the objection embodies deserves attention. It reminds us that anticipatory content is not automatically trustworthy, simply because it proves accurate on specific occasions. The question of what source the content comes from, what interest that source may have, and what direction it may lead the experiencer matters. The traditions develop discernment practices in part to address this question. Modern dismissive accounts that treat all such concerns as primitive superstition overlook the sophistication with which the traditions engaged a real problem. Now let us trace the connections. The time illusion investigation established that time does not flow in the way ordinary experience suggests. The passage of time is a feature of perspective rather than a feature of reality itself. The premonition investigation builds directly on this foundation. If time does not flow, then the future does not arrive. The future simply is at its coordinates in the unified structure, and the possibility of anticipatory information reaching present consciousness follows from the fact that future events are already present in the structure, awaiting only the mechanisms through which consciousness can access them from its particular location. The retrocausality investigation documented that future events can influence past ones through quantum mechanisms that delayed choice experiments have confirmed. The premonition investigation extends this. The influence that operates at the quantum level may, through biological systems sensitive to quantum processes, reach the level of conscious experience. The transactional interpretation provides a theoretical framework within which this extension becomes intelligible. What begins as quantum retrocausality at the scale of single photons extends, through the quantum sensitivity of biological systems, into anticipatory capacity at the scale of whole persons, capacity that the documented cases illustrate at the macroscopic level of dreams, impressions, and visions of coming events. The fate investigation established that the future exists in the block universe structure, that its content is determinate even while the agent's choices remain genuine contributors to what that content is. The premonition investigation adds the epistemological dimension. The block universe contains the future. The question is what access any particular consciousness has to information about regions of the block that have not yet been traversed. The answer, on the evidence the investigations have assembled, is that limited access is available through limited channels, more readily in some states of consciousness than in others, more reliably in some individuals than in others, with specific content rather than complete maps. The intuition investigation established that non-local information reaches consciousness through channels the conventional framework does not describe. The premonition investigation is a particular case of this broader phenomenon. Intuition refers to immediate knowing about present realities that conventional perception has not consciously processed. Premonition refers to immediate knowing about future realities that have not yet occurred. Both operate through the relaxed filtering of ordinary perception, accessing content that the ordinary filter excludes. The premonition capacity is continuous with the intuitive capacity, differing in the temporal region of the content accessed rather than in any fundamental structural difference. The memory investigation established that the past persists and that access to it is available through cultivated contemplative practices. The premonition investigation extends this across the other temporal direction. Memory accesses preserved past regions of the structure. Premonition accesses future regions. Both operate through the same kind of relaxed interface, the same kind of expanded awareness, the same kind of contemplative cultivation. The traditions that develop memory practices also develop premonition practices, because the underlying capacity that both engage is the same capacity applied to different temporal regions. The laws of existence investigation establish the three principles. Observation creates reality. Nothing is separate. Information cannot be destroyed. The premonition investigation applies each. The first law implies that the observation involved in perceiving future events participates in their actualization at the quantum level. The second law implies that the premonition is not separable from the event. The perceiver and the perceived are connected at the level where the anticipation becomes possible. The third law implies that the information about future events is preserved in the structure, awaiting only the access channel through which conscious awareness can reach it. The dream's investigation established that sleep produces altered states in which informational access differs from waking consciousness. The premonition investigation connects directly. Dreams are the most common channel through which anticipatory information reaches ordinary people, and the dream state provides the conditions under which the filtering of ordinary perception relaxes sufficiently to permit content from temporal regions beyond the present to become accessible. The synchronicity investigation documented meaningful coincidences between inner states and outer events that exceed what chance alone can account for. The premonition investigation is related but distinct. Synchronicity involves meaningful connection between the inner and the outer in the present moment. Premonition involves anticipatory connection between the inner and events that have not yet occurred. Both operate through channels the conventional framework excludes. Both suggest that consciousness is involved in the structure of reality at levels that ordinary perception does not recognize. The fear investigation established that chronic fear produces specific physiological effects on cognition and well-being. The premonition investigation connects. Ordinary anxiety about the future, the repetitive projection of feared scenarios, is a different phenomenon from genuine anticipation. Ordinary anxiety produces chronic stress without delivering accurate information. Genuine anticipation, when it occurs, arrives with a particular felt quality and delivers content that the anxious projection does not provide. Learning to distinguish the two reduces the suffering that anxious projection produces, while allowing genuine signals to be received. The practice of this distinction is itself a form of psychological and spiritual development. The heart investigation established that the heart is not merely a pump, but an intelligent organ with its own perceptual capacities. The premonition investigation draws on this directly. The practices that traditions across cultures have developed for cultivating heart-based intelligence, Christian contemplative prayer, focused on the heart, Sufi practices of dhikr, the heart-centered meditations of multiple Buddhist traditions may be developing, specifically the anticipatory capacity that the laboratory research documents at a lower level in ordinary subjects. The creativity investigation established that genuine creative insights arrive from beyond the individual mind. The premonition investigation connects to this directly. The same substrate from which creative inspiration emerges contains the content that anticipatory perception accesses. The difference is the temporal direction of the access. Creative insight often draws from the timeless dimension of pattern and possibility. Premonition draws from the future direction of temporal sequence. Both are access to information that the ordinary channels do not provide. Both are real capacities whose cultivation the traditions have refined. Every investigation connects. The investigations produce a unified picture of what consciousness is, what reality is, and what the relationship between them permits. Premonition is one thread in this picture. It is not a paranormal anomaly that violates the otherwise orderly structure of reality. It is a feature of that structure, properly understood. Now let us turn to the practical applications. The framework does not remain theoretical. It translates into specific practices that transform the experience of being a conscious being in time. 6 applications follow directly from the framework, each addressing a particular region of ordinary human experience that the framework illuminates. The first and most immediate application is the transformation of your relationship to your own anticipatory experiences. You have had them. If you are ordinary in this respect, you have had many of them. The dream that left you with an uneasy feeling that was later justified by events. The sudden impression that you should call someone, arriving on the day that person was in crisis. The intuition that directed you away from a situation that later proved dangerous. The knowing about a loved one's difficulty, arriving across geographical distance at approximately the time the difficulty was occurring. These experiences have been happening to you. The question is how you relate to them. The framework suggests a particular orientation. Take them seriously as potentially meaningful. Do not dismiss them as random noise. At the same time, do not invest any single experience with more weight than the evidence supports. Document them when they occur, before any events can have occurred to which they might correspond. Observe over time whether your anticipatory impressions tend to be accurate. Learn the felt quality of the experiences that turn out to be accurate, which typically differs in specific ways from the felt quality of ordinary anxiety, and develop the capacity to act on them when the action is low cost and high value, while refraining from acting when the cost of a false positive would be high. The second application is the cultivation of the capacity itself. The traditions have developed specific practices. Some of them are accessible to ordinary practitioners without requiring extensive religious commitment. The specific form of meditation matters less than the sustained commitment. Breath-focused attention, mantra-based concentration, body scan awareness, open awareness, each of these approaches, sustained for 20 to 40 minutes daily across years, develops the underlying attentional capacity that the traditions associate with accurate anticipatory perception. Regular meditation practice, sustained across years, tends to increase the frequency and apparent accuracy of anticipatory experiences reported by practitioners. The technique is simple. Keep paper and pen within reach of your bed. The moment you wake, before moving or checking a phone, record whatever fragments of dream content remain in awareness. Do not try to make the content coherent. Do not edit or interpret. Simply transcribe what was there. Over weeks and months of sustained practice, the apparent volume of recallable dream content increases substantially, and patterns become visible in the content that single dreams could not reveal. Keeping a dream journal, recorded immediately upon waking, develops the capacity to remember dream content that would otherwise be lost, and reveals anticipatory content that might not otherwise be recognized. Specific contemplative practices, the Ignatian examen, the Sufi practice of Faika, the Buddhist practice of Vipassana, develop the discriminating attention that allows reliable content to be distinguished from noise. The cultivation is not trivial. It requires sustained commitment over years. But the results, for those who commit to the practice, have been documented across traditions. The third application is the ethical framework within which anticipatory knowledge is engaged. The traditions were consistent about this. Anticipatory capacity develops alongside moral and psychological integration, not as a separate track. A person in chaos projects chaos onto what they perceive. A person at peace can perceive more clearly what is actually there. The development of accurate anticipatory capacity requires in the traditions consistent testimony, the development of the psychological stability and moral clarity that allow clean perception. Shortcuts do not work. Drug-induced experiences can provide temporary glimpses but do not produce sustained capacity. The development requires the whole person engaged in the whole practice. The fourth application is the reframing of anxiety about the future. Much of human suffering involves anxiety about what may happen. The mind projects feared futures, rehearses disasters, anticipates losses. Most of this projection is not genuine anticipation. It is anxious imagination, producing suffering without corresponding insight into what is actually coming. The suffering that anxious projection produces is substantial. Studies of anxiety disorders document chronic health consequences, reduced life satisfaction, and persistent suffering that does not correlate with actual future outcomes. The worries mostly do not come true, but they produce real distress in the meantime. This is the cost of the modern tendency to project feared futures constantly, while dismissing the occasional, genuine anticipatory signal that might warrant actual preparation. The framework the investigations have developed suggests a different orientation. The future exists. Some information about it is accessible in limited ways through specific channels. The information that reaches you through reliable channels deserves attention. The anxious projections that merely rehearse feared scenarios do not. The practice of distinguishing genuine anticipatory insight from anxious imagination is itself liberating. It reduces the suffering that ungrounded anxiety produces, while allowing the genuine signals to be received. The fifth application addresses the most difficult of all anticipatory considerations, the awareness of one's own mortality. The fifth application is the relationship to death. Every person knows that death is coming. The knowing is typically abstract, a general recognition that mortality exists, usually pushed to the margins of awareness. Some people receive more specific anticipatory content about their own deaths. The tradition contains extensive documented cases of individuals who knew in advance that their deaths were near. The documented cases are remarkable in their specificity. Saints who announced their impending deaths to their communities weeks or months before the event. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most significant theologians in Christian history, ceased his writing on the 6th of December, 1273, after a mystical experience. When urged to resume, he said only, "I can do no more. Such things have been revealed to me that all I have written seems to me as straw." He died 3 months later. The connection between his mystical experience and his anticipated death is not reducible to coincidence. Similar patterns recur in the hagiographic literature of multiple traditions. Ordinary people who reported specific anticipatory content, dreams, impressions, conversations, shortly before dying of circumstances they had not rationally expected. The framework does not require that everyone receive such content. It suggests that the capacity for this kind of anticipatory awareness exists, is more common than contemporary culture acknowledges, and can be cultivated to some degree by those who engage the practices the traditions have developed. Beyond the individual engagement with mortality lies the relational dimension. The sixth application is the relationship to the people you love. Much of the documented anticipatory experience involves knowledge of significant events in the lives of closely connected people. Mothers knowing their children are in trouble, partners knowing across distances that their partners have died, close friends knowing of each other's crises in real time. These connections operate through the non-local channels that the research is beginning to map. The implication is that the love you have for specific people is not merely a psychological state in your individual consciousness. It creates a specific kind of connection that extends through the non-local substrate, carrying information about the beloved state, about what the beloved will experience. The love is real. The connection is real. And the information that sometimes reaches you through the connection is, in the framework the investigations have developed, real information about real events. Consider what this means. The tradition that has thought most carefully about this is the Christian tradition of intercessory prayer, the practice of praying for specific people based on awareness of their need. The practice assumes that knowledge of the need can reach the one praying through channels that do not require explicit communication. Millions of Christians across centuries have reported that sudden impulses to pray for specific people have turned out to coincide with specific crises those people were experiencing at the time. The testimony is not proof, but the pattern, replicated across vast populations and sustained periods, suggests something about how the non-local connections among people operate. Consider the dream you had last week that left you uneasy about someone you love. Consider the sudden impression that arrived for no reason, directing your attention toward a friend you had not thought of in months. Consider the feeling you have sometimes had about a significant decision, a quiet conviction that carries a particular tone that your anxious thoughts do not produce. These are not all meaningful. Many of them are ordinary mental noise, but some of them are genuine signals, carrying genuine information about events that have not yet occurred, arriving through channels that are real even though they are not fully mapped. You do not have to become a mystic to engage this capacity. You do not have to enter a monastery or undertake extreme practices. You only have to pay attention. Pay attention to the experiences that arrive with the particular quality of genuine arriving, rather than being constructed. Pay attention to the impressions that turn out to be accurate, and to the felt signature that characterizes them. Pay attention to the shifts in your own awareness that precede significant events, and learn over time to recognize the shifts before the events arrive. The future is not entirely inaccessible. It is not entirely accessible either. It exists in a specific relationship to your present awareness, available in limited ways through specific channels, more available to cultivated attention than to ordinary distracted consciousness. What you are, in this framework, is not an isolated consciousness trapped in a sequential moment. What you are is a participating awareness embedded in a reality whose structure extends across time, connected to specific other beings through channels that ordinary perception excludes, carrying within your own experience the distributed capacity that every human tradition has been refining since human beings began paying sustained attention to their own consciousness. The traditions have been mapping this territory for thousands of years. The physics has been confirming the structural possibility. The laboratory research has been documenting specific instances in controlled conditions, and your own experience, if you attend to it, contains evidence that the framework is describing something real. Consider what this implies for how you live. The scientific framework that has dominated modern culture has tended to treat anticipatory experience as error, as cognitive malfunction, as superstition, as something to be explained away rather than engaged seriously. The framework has been wrong about this. The evidence does not support the dismissive account. The contemplative traditions, which the dismissive account treated as primitive precursors to scientific understanding, turn out to have been investigating a real phenomenon with methodologies sophisticated enough to produce convergent findings across cultures that had no contact with each other. The sophistication was not matched by modern dismissal. The dismissal was itself unsophisticated. Something in you knows. Not everything, not with certainty, not in the reliable, continuous way that a fantasy of prophecy might suggest, but something intermittent, partial, calling for discernment and humility knows. The knowing arrives sometimes in dreams, sometimes in sudden impressions during ordinary activities, sometimes in specific bodily sensations, sometimes in the felt sense of a person close to you, carrying information about what they are experiencing at that moment across whatever distance separates you. The channels vary. The reality of some access to some information about what has not yet occurred is consistent across the range of evidence the investigations have examined. You are not trapped in the present. You are not a being confined to the immediate moment, waiting helplessly for a future that arrives from outside your awareness. You are a being embedded in a reality whose structure extends across time, whose informational architecture includes the temporal regions you have not yet traversed, whose connections to specific other beings carry information that the ordinary framework cannot account for. The future does not surprise you entirely. Some of it has already reached you, through dreams you have forgotten, through impressions you have dismissed, through moments of knowing that carried specific conviction for reasons you could not articulate. Some of it will reach you again, in specific ways, in the weeks and months and years ahead. The practice is available to you, not because you have special capacity that ordinary people lack, because you have the same capacity that every person has, distributed across the population in varying degrees, available to cultivation by anyone who commits to the sustained engagement the traditions have developed. You do not need to believe the framework, you only need to test it. Pay attention to your own experience. Observe whether the framework's predictions match what you find. Let the evidence accumulate in your own life. Your task is to pay attention. The distinction is not trivial. It requires sustained practice. It requires honest tracking of what turns out to be accurate versus what turns out to be projection. It requires the willingness to be wrong and to learn from being wrong. Your task is to distinguish the signal from the noise. Your task is to receive what comes, with the humility the traditions have consistently insisted on, without the attachment that would distort the perception. The humility is not weakness. It is the recognition that your access is partial, your discernment fallible, your capacity continuing to develop through the practice itself. The absence of attachment is not indifference. It is the freedom that allows clear reception, without the distorting hope or fear that would colour what you see. The work takes a lifetime. It does not produce a finished state. Each phase of life presents new anticipatory territory to engage, new discernments to refine, new signals and noise to distinguish. The practice continues until the practitioner crosses the final horizon into the region that contemplative traditions have been describing in their own vocabularies across millennia. And your task is to live forward, moment by moment, with the strange and paradoxical awareness that what you will encounter is already, in some mysterious way, already reaching you, asking for your attention, preparing you for what you cannot fully know until it arrives. This is not mysticism in the pejorative sense. This is not fantasy about supernatural powers. This is the integration of laboratory research, contemporary physics, and accumulated contemplative wisdom into a coherent picture of what reality is and what human consciousness does within it. The picture is startling only if the ordinary framework of a mechanical, causally closed, temporally sequential universe is assumed without examination. When that framework is examined, it turns out to be inadequate to the best physics we have. The adequate framework, the one that contemporary physics actually supports, includes the dimensions of reality that make premonition intelligible rather than mysterious. The future is not a wall. The future is a horizon, with light coming across it, reaching you now, in ways you have already been receiving and will continue to receive, as long as you are awake enough to notice. The real work is not dramatic. It is not about producing reliable predictions or becoming a seer. It is about developing the attentional quality that allows you to register the information that is already reaching you, which you have been dismissing because the conventional framework told you that such registration was impossible. The framework was wrong. The information is real, and your capacity to receive it, to distinguish it from noise, to respond to it with wisdom rather than anxiety. This capacity is what the traditions have been refining across thousands of years and what remains available to you now, in this specific moment, if you are willing to begin. The beginning is simple. Pay attention to your dreams. Pay attention to the impressions that arrive without apparent cause. Pay attention to the knowing that arrives in forms your conscious mind has not yet articulated. Pay attention to the people you love and to the information that sometimes reaches you about their state through channels that the conventional framework excludes. Most of what you notice will be ordinary mental noise. Some of it will be something more. Over time, the patterns will emerge. The experiences that tend to be accurate will develop a recognizable signature that distinguishes them from the experiences that turn out to be projection. The signature is not the same for everyone. Different people experience genuine anticipation through different felt qualities, but each person who develops the capacity develops familiarity with their own particular mode of accurate perception. The familiarity is what allows the signal to be distinguished from the noise. It is what allows action to be taken when the action is warranted, and restraint to be exercised when the impression is not sufficiently clear to justify action. The practice of discerning which is which, that is where the work begins. And the work, sustained across months and years and decades, is what develops the capacity that the traditions have been describing. The capacity is not magic. It is not superstition. It is a feature of human consciousness that operates in ways the conventional framework excludes, but that reality itself permits. You are not trapped in the present moment with no access to what is coming. You are embedded in a reality that extends across time, connected to specific other beings through specific non-local channels, capable of receiving information through forms of perception that your training may have taught you to dismiss, but that remain available to you whenever you choose to pay the kind of attention the traditions have always prescribed. And the practice of noticing that is where the real work begins.